Hi, I'm Ted Santos, and I am your host of Straight Talk. We are the talk show that is made for men by men, except ladies, you never want to miss it. We talk about social challenges, we talk about relationships, and I'm even qualified to speak to you at a very high level about business. So, I did a video, it was a really short video. I talked about a show that I had coming up, and that show was about hiring too many women in the workplace and how that diminishes profit margins for a lot of companies. Show went really well. And so today I want to speak to you a little bit about some of the things that came out of that show. I want to maybe talk a little bit more about the article I mentioned in the last short video. And I want to speak to you about a recent video that was featured a woman CEO and her thoughts about hiring women. These are her thoughts. These are not mine. So I often like to talk about facts instead of giving you my opinion about things. Definitely not my feelings. So Sunday, my show the title was, How Do You Make Corporations Profitable Again? Remove most women from the workforce. That was the short answer. And it was really interesting. I had a guy who used to work at IBM, and he's a programmer, right? And he worked in a department at IBM. This would be, I guess, in the 80s, 90s. And he talked about how they hired a woman. She was the first woman to come in there. I'm pretty sure he said the first woman to come into their department who was a programmer. And he said she understood programming. She could do a lot of the work. However, she often would get stuck when she would hit a difficult snag. Instead of her problem solving and figuring it out, he said she would intentionally, and he said she had a nice rack on her. So the day that she wanted help from guys, she would come in with wearing a top that was kind of a low cleavage. It accentuated her breast. And when she would wear that, guys, the way he said it, they would line up. And whatever she needed help with, they would do it. They would solve her problems. So if you don't see that as being for her being a liability to IBM, he said they eventually promoted her and gave her a job doing presentations where she had to have some knowledge of programming. He said she did pretty well with that because she was presenting to mostly guys, and guys, I guess they liked looking at her, and they paid attention to what she was saying. And I have heard there are lots of women who can do very well in sales, especially if she's attractive and understands what she's selling. So that's a good place to have women. Except to have her in programming, one, she wasn't 100% competent for the job. So this is one of the challenges of affirmative action. And if you look at me, some of you may say, how could you say anything against affirmative action? Well, affirmative action literally just drops the bar. So this woman was able to get into programming because they lowered the bar so she could get in. And her strategy, instead of knowing and being really proficient or mastering her craft, she didn't master her craft. Well, at least not for the job. She mastered female nature, which is when I'm stuck, I'll get some guy to figure out and solve my problem, which means you are incompetent for the job. Almost competent, except incompetent to do the job 100%. And the guy telling this on my talk show was saying, men just figured out their own problems, right? I mean, not to say they never brainstormed, but this woman would take advantage of the men. So because she's incompetent, she can't get the job done. So now you're paying her to to do the job of a man, and she's incapable, right? So there's a loss of profits right there. So right there, the company is not getting a return on their investment. And now she's distracting other men and literally pulling them from their job, which means now the company is not getting its productivity from a couple of men in the organization who are now helping her. So that means the company lost twice from her. And somehow women don't see this as a problem. I assume this is this entitlement, like a woman has a right to not be competent and for someone to help her. And not think this is a problem to the company. If you have that happening in several places throughout an organization, that can make an organization very unprofitable. Which means companies become unprofitable, they have to start laying people off. So that becomes bad for society. And somehow women don't see that as a problem. So in preparing for the show, a couple of things were found. There were lots of studies that were done, and they looked at countries like the United States, Norway, and Sweden. And these, Sweden is very much egalitarian and does a lot to make sure they hire a lot of women in the workforce. So they looked at jobs where men and women were doing the same exact job, same tools, same company. And what did they find? That there were some jobs where if it was, let's say, assembly line, and it required putting small pieces together, because women have smaller hands, women were more efficient in doing that job than men. And they even found in sewing, like when you were they were sewing handkerchiefs or sewing the sheets for a bed, the men were hands down more productive with the sheets, with the small handkerchiefs. Women were better because of the small size of it, and women being able to more easily manipulate the size and get it done quicker. But they couldn't do it when it came to something bigger. And a sheet is not that it's heavy. This is not about physical power and labor. It's about just the efficiency and productivity of men. So in these studies, they found that in most cases where women were more efficient, another place was in Norway, when it came to filleting a fish, they said women were more productive. They could take the fish, fillet it, and move on to the next fish. When it came to being a butcher, when you had these large slabs or side of beef, that women were much more inefficient than men. They couldn't handle the knife as well as men could. So when it came to filleting fish, the companies avoided hiring men because men were inefficient. So they would pay, if they did hire men, they would pay the women more. When it came to being a butcher, of course, men made more. They avoided hiring women. So they found this pattern, this trend, where women were actually better. Women actually made more in that job than they would pay men. However, if you look across the board, even when you look at being a doctor, right? Delivering babies, or a lawyer, and handling cases, men are more efficient. They even took it a step further, and they looked at companies with all men and all women. Men were 15% more productive than the companies. The all men companies were 15% more productive than all women. Every time. And they also looked at, so when you account for the areas where women are more productive than men and how women get paid, there is no wage gap. And there were some areas where they said there might have been a 1% wage gap. So they said, when they looked at it, 2/3 of the reason that men get paid more was because they were more productive. The 1/3, they said, could have been discrimination, except they think it may have been because the man had more experience, or men put in significantly more time. And that's where women don't compete with men. And that brings me, it brings me to a video recently posted. I'll post the link below. There's a woman at looks like a presentation in an auditorium. I don't know if it was at a university. And there are 3 women on the stage, and they are there to talk about why you should hire women in the workplace. So a woman in the audience stands up, gets at the mic, and it sounds very much like she has a fairly strong Russian accent. And she says, I'm the CEO of a company and I hire people. She said, I was also a model. I modeled for a while. And she said she went off to a high-tech school to get her education in computer programming, coding. And she said there were about 100 men and only about 8 women. And she said from what she saw that the women were not good. They didn't learn coding the same as men did. They were not as smart. They cheated. And she said when it came to hiring, she actually did stand for hiring women instead of men. And she did that. And the women were not as productive. They didn't know the coding because they didn't study as well in school. And she said in school they cheated. So when it came time to get hired and do the job, it showed. And she said, you don't see women staying late at night to work on projects. She said, you see men doing that. And she said, why men work later? I don't know. I don't understand. Well, yes, I understand why she doesn't know that. But if you look at the biology, if you understand the biochemistry of men and women, testosterone, and there are other biochemicals that make men more aggressive, more competitive, like physically aggressive. What that translates, it transfers into the way we work, our work ethic, and we will drive to work extra hours, whether we're a doctor, an attorney, engineer, doesn't matter, coding, it shows up everywhere. And that is exactly what accounts for most of the gap. If anything, we've overpaid women because most women don't do that. And when you factor in, and some of these studies I was looking at, when you factor in when women have children, their productivity drops even more. These studies found that women take 50 to 70% more sick days than men. 50 to 70% more when they have children. This is a problem, but no one wants to address that. So this opens up all kinds of other questions, right? So in my past shows, we've talked about whether or not the pandemic is an opportunity to bring the country to a level of normalcy, right? Because the question is, if we are paying women more than their fair share because they are not as productive and they're demanding to be paid more without substantiating the productivity and efficiency that men provide, then that means they are milking companies. They are hurting the economics of the nation and the economics of a company. And is that sustainable? So is this pandemic an opportunity to bring us back to normalcy? And by that, I'm saying, well, pandemic, quarantine, most of the jobs that continue to work, trucking, labor, of course you have nurses, and I think our nation, the world is happy to have women as nurses. And I understand many more women are medical doctors now. However, there are a lot of single women in the United States. And many of these single women have children, especially younger children. Some are even in daycare, or they're in school. So the schools and daycares are closed. That means if we say everyone back to work and the daycares are closed, daycare centers and the elementary schools are closed, these children may be too young for women to leave them home. And with the coronavirus, is it safe to leave your children with just some babysitter who could be sick and infect your children? And if, as a mother, you have parents who are older, is it safe to leave your children with their grandparents when they could infect their grandparents, get the grandparents sick, and they die? So that means mom can't go to work because she can't leave her children home alone. And if she does, she could end up in jail, which then that's a whole nother problem, right? So if women are not in a position to go back to work, that means we'll have to start putting men back in positions, which means that we then pay men for the actual productivity that they provide, and there's no entitlement to say they should get paid even though they don't produce as much as men. And men take less sick time. Men are less... Part of the unproductiveness in the workforce from women shows up in another article called "Cat Fights Over Handbags and Tears in the Toilets," when this producer launched a woman-only TV company she thought she'd kiss goodbye to conflict. So here's a woman who's a founder of a company. She opens it up. It's a TV company, and she's standing for having a women-only company, and it was a disaster. In the end, she filed bankruptcy, and she went out of business because women were catty, they were petty, they argued over whose wardrobe was the best, purses. They talk about if men did this, it would be considered sexual harassment because they talked about who they had sex with, how long they were having sex, how many partners, what they did with their husbands, and dating, and all this stuff that is considered illegal in the workplace. Yet when you put all women in there, it's okay. And women argued and bickered. They fought verbally so bad that some of the women went into the bathroom and cried. And then the women couldn't work. And sometimes the arguments were so extreme that no one worked. The woman also, in this article, and this is the CEO telling about this, said women called in because they had their menstrual cycle. And then when they did come to work, they were moody. So she said every week, someone could easily be on their menstrual cycle, which means every week they were dealing with moodiness. This affects productivity. We don't want to talk about these things. And as men, if we do bring it up, I did a show talking about women wanting equality. And I talked about women on their menstrual cycle and calling in sick. And there was all kinds of, I was told by women that that's not true and that women wouldn't do that. And that's a rare occasion. We shouldn't talk about it. But here we are, a woman telling you that's exactly what happened in her company. So how sustainable is it if we know, if all the research shows that women are less productive than men, and not only on assembly lines, and yes, granted, there are places where women are more productive. How much more time do we need to accept the fact that we are going down a dead-end street that will bankrupt us? And I want to bring this to a close, right? So economically, how sustainable is this? What are the other problems that we're having? When you take women and put them in the workforce, they're no longer holding the education system accountable, right? So they're not going to all the parent-teacher meetings. They're not as diligent about making sure that children do the homework and making sure they understand what the children are being taught. That means no one's holding the education system accountable except the education system. So why is it failing? Because in the old days, women were on top of it as mothers. The other thing is, when Women say, well, I have my own money, I don't need a man. The child experiences trauma. That's a problem. Emotional trauma. So one of the things that we may have been hiding this and playing a shell game, I've spent a lot of time talking about this with former CEOs of Fortune 500s. And I want to say this quickly. So, companies do well, and then they're not doing well, and they lay people off, right? So I've asked retired CEOs of Fortune 500s, there has to be a rock we didn't look under, and under that rock is some other way of handling hiring in good times, firing in bad times, right? And when he and I had this conversation, we had it over several days, over many, many hours. We were peeling down that actually what starts to happen is you lay off 10,000 people, and I'm in the auto industry. I lay off 10,000. Well, that means 10,000 people that may not be buying homes and other products, so the home builders have to lay off 10,000. And then that means the washer and dryer company is going to lay off. And it's a downward spiral, a race to the bottom, right? So then companies end up playing a shell game, right? So if you publicly trade it, you change accounting principles, you buy back shares, which inflates your earnings, and it makes it seem like you're doing really well. Except, really, your profits are not as good in the company, right? So because you're not as profitable, you just have to lay people off. Even if things if there's one little hiccup in the economy, you just lay off 10, 20,000 people, right? So the first company, the auto company that laid off 10,000, they lay off 10,000. Other industries lay off 10,000. Which then affects how many cars are bought. Now you have to lay off 20,000, which means other people are laying off. This is, a horrible cycle. So I'm wondering, one of our problems that affects productivity is divorce, right? So we're losing $6 billion in productivity just from divorce, because at any point, a percentage of your employee population is headed for divorce, in the middle of divorce, or just coming out of one. And divorce is a huge distraction, and people don't work as hard. When you have people who are already less productive, women less productive than men, and they are going through a divorce, and 70% of divorces are initiated by women, now they're even less productive, and now the company is even less profitable, which means you have to lay people off. And the way corporations hide that is they buy back shares. They do all kinds of things, from laying people off, putting people in different divisions, firing the more senior people, and then hiring low, entry level people. All these little tricks, right? Maybe we have to start looking at this as a society. Because one of the other things I found in my research is that from 1948 until the mid-60s, productivity was going up at 108% in that time period. And wages went up 91%. Well, from 1968 until 2015, productivity didn't go up. It only went up about 60%. So it didn't take that 108% increase where you had the majority of men in the workplace. It only went up slightly. And as a result, wages stagnated. So the more women we put in the workforce, the less productive corporations are becoming. And that's affecting wages, wage stagnation. Yet we still have to charge more to make up for the amount of women we hire in the workforce. And with a wage stagnation, to make up for unproductive women, Well, now you need two people in a workplace, which means you don't have as much care for your children, where your children become less educated, and less educated people are not as productive in the workforce, and we are just slitting our wrist. Like, does anyone see this? Fellas, at every level, we have to rethink the value of trying to make women equal in the workforce. It's not working. We are killing ourselves as a society. Like, we don't want to admit it. Some of you have daughters and you want your daughters to be treated equally, except you don't teach your daughter to be equal because you're not telling her that she has to demand to pay for first dates, and that she has to drop to one knee and put a ring on her finger and open a door for guys and all these things that are deemed as a man's job. You're not telling her she has to be equal in that. And when she goes to work, she's like that programmer at IBM who believed if she couldn't do the job, she'll just figure out a way to get men to do the job for her. And this happens often across many professions. Guys, if we're going to save the economic and psychological well-being of our nation, of our planet, we have to be way more intelligent about who we put in the workforce, because with 51% of the workforce women, this is not a good path. All the numbers show women are not as productive. Sure, there are outliers, but that's not even 10% of the women. So, I got it. You have groups like MGTOW and CISPM and IBMOR and Red Pill and Black Pill. This has got to go beyond just social. It's mandatory that we start looking at the economics of our country, of our nation, and our productivity. If women have a problem with men making sound economic decisions and putting the most productive person in the workforce, if they have a problem with that, they can do what this female CEO did in creating her TV company. And she hired all women. And she saw the disaster of that. And the Russian woman who writes code, she already learned the lesson of hiring women who were less competent because they cheated their way through school. And they don't want to put in the hours. It's on us to bring back normalcy. This pandemic may be a huge opportunity to do this, where women don't get called back to work. Or if they do, and they're single and they can't make it, it's just not our problem. If we don't do something, we may be soon looking at the ruins in the same way we look at Greece and Rome. So, if you think I'm an extremist, tell me. I want to hear it. I want to hear your comments. Tell me that I'm outrageous. Tell me that I haven't thought this through and there's so many other mitigating circumstances that I haven't even considered. Tell me what they are. Dislike it if you don't like what I said. But like my video, share it. Send it to other women. I want to hear what women have to say about the facts. I know they're allergic to them. So like and share my video. I look for your support and your comments. Subscribe to my channel. It's growing. I thank all of you who have supported me. And until the next message, join me on my shows on Sunday for Straight Talk at 7 p.m. And until then, thank you everyone and take care.